How are you all today on this lovely winter February morning? Good, good. Well, we're going to have a great day today. Welcome to Saturday University, sponsored by the University of Wyoming, the Teton County Library, the Wyoming Humanities Council, and of course, this wonderful institution itself. I'm Paul Flesher. I direct the Religious Studies program at the University of Wyoming, and I will be your MC for the day. In the usual way of these things, I need to start by thanking our sponsors, and I'd certainly like to begin by thanking the National Museum of Wildlife Art, who provided this room, provided the coffee, and, by the way, provided free entry into the gallery in between sessions, if you would like to take advantage of that. Having said that, we've also organized a evaluation. If you would see things that you like and would like to see repeated, please fill out the evaluation as you go out the door after each of the sessions. If you see things that you'd like improved, please do that as well. Teton County Library and the Teton County Library Foundation have been very supportive of our efforts here and creating it. And let me also mention, in particular, the University of Wyoming Foundation and the university as well. Each of today's speakers are from the University of Wyoming. We've come up here to sort of share some of the things we know, give you a sense of some of the things that we teach our students or would like our students to be learning from us. And let me just give you a sense of the schedule for today. There'll be 3 individual lectures. At 9 right now, Marianne Kamp will speak on exporting democracy, lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq. At 10:30, Professor Phil Holt will speak on Greek heroes, good guys, bad guys, or both. There will then be a lunch break from about 11:45 to 1. And then at 1 o'clock, Steve Easton, who is the new dean of the law school, will speak on theories of punishment. What is justice? And then we'll wrap it up with a roundtable discussion from about 2:30 to 3:15 with all 3 professors on the stage, and I will, I guess, moderate. Let me also mention that this is the second of 3 Saturday Universities this year. The last one will be on June 12th, another Saturday after mud season. So we'll hope you will look forward to that and come out to that. So with those comments in mind, let me introduce our first speaker this morning. Back when there was a USSR, before it fell, we often thought of everything that was part of that as separate somehow from the rest of the world. Since the collapse of the former USSR, we've suddenly realized again that the Middle East and Asia are right next to each other. They are not separated by some large wall or monumental divide. At the University of Wyoming, our person who is teaching us and helping us relearn the connectedness of Asia, in particular Central Asia, with Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, and the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, and so on, is Marianne Kamp. And we're very pleased to have her here this morning. Marianne is an associate professor of history at the University of Wyoming. She's one of those multi-talented people. I can claim her as a member of my religious studies faculty, but at the moment she's also the director of the Women's Studies program, where she's been quite active and successful. She teaches a number of courses on the Middle East, on Russia, and on Islam. Her most recent book is called The New Women in Uzbekistan. It's based on almost 20 years of visits and conversations with people in Uzbekistan. Now she's working on a history of collective farming in Uzbekistan, working with by interviews by people who are actually doing the farming and so on. So without any further ado, let me introduce Marianne Kamp, who will speak to us on exporting democracy, lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq. Marianne.
Thank you. It's really nice to see such a great crowd here. And I hope that I won't fall on my face too much with this presentation. Sometimes when I speak, I'm very confident about what I'm saying, but actually today I'm venturing into territory that is traditionally the bailiwick of political scientists and not historians. And so I'm really worried about having my words immortalized on film. Like, oh, great, now all my political scientist friends who do this stuff will hear what I say and think, what in the world was she talking about? Okay, so exporting democracy. This is a topic that has interested me for quite a while, largely because I showed up to do research in Uzbekistan just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, spring of 1991. And when I went back to do more extensive research the following year, there was a brand new country and a massive proliferation of what became known as non-governmental organizations, all of them somehow trying to create what we were beginning to call civil society. And these were brand new terms for me, like non-government NGO, what? Civil society, what? I'm a historian. I don't understand these things or deal with them. And yet, from going back again and again and being involved with all sorts of things that are going on in Central Asia, I became much more familiar with them than I ever thought I would be. And as a historian then, when I look at this process of exporting democracy and the way that we're talking about it in the 2000s, I want to have a little historical perspective on that. Go back a little and see what were we talking about some years ago when we talked about this. What do we mean by it? And does it ever actually work at all? Okay, so let's see what happens here. Let me tell you, first of all, okay, my punchline, it can't hurt. I actually will have a slightly more complex conclusion than that. But I'm putting a bunch of things up here on PowerPoint, and I have mixed feelings about PowerPoint because really what I like to see on PowerPoint are maps and pictures. But I put quite a lot of my words up here, and that is partly because I have developed a little bit of a habit when talking to audiences that I'm not so certain about of doing that, partly because if anybody has a problem with hearing, it can be really helpful to see the words. So not all of my words are up here, but I guarantee most of what is up here will not be remotely interesting unless you kind of needed to go back and confirm. Now, what was it she was talking about? Aha. So I don't put them up there to entertain you, and please don't be annoyed that I have so many words up there. You don't need to look at them, really. So a little outline here. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about my own experience with this phenomenon of exporting democracy, and that comes from some activities that I've been involved in. I will talk a bit about a history here of exporting democracy, and then I want to start defining what do we mean when we say democracy. We use that term in quite a lot of ways. What do the people who think they are exporting democracy think they are exporting? Where, when, why has this happened? How, what are some of the means? And then I'll be moving into some specific examples, which are about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then Iraq and the Middle East a little bit, and Afghanistan. And finally, we'll come to this question of does this actually make a difference? When certain entities decide that they can export democracy, does that work? Is it effective? What are its possibilities, and what are the problems with that? Okay, so I'll put this up, and I may just come back to it later on because it's much more interesting than any other graphic I have. I want to make a little illustration here of what one entity, organization, Freedom House, considers when they look around the world. They say, so which countries really are free, which ones really have democracy, and which ones don't? And they divide it up here with green as quite free, yellow as partially free, and purple as not. And I would point out that most of the places that I think about and talk about are in the not category still, as of the 2008 or 2009 map. So I'll come back to this a number of times in order to talk about what Freedom House thinks of when they say democracy. What are they including in that category, and what are they not? Why would they define some places as free and other places as not? Okay, so, all right. This is a long quotation, so you can just close your eyes and not look at it. We'll go back to the map. Can I go back on this thing? Let me see. Previous. Oh, yeah, but I have this weird little clicker job. Okay. And show. No, I don't want to do that. Previous. There we go. All right, so you can look at that before we get to this long quotation. All right. My own little window on democracy promotion. I explained that I started doing research in Uzbekistan in the early 1990s, and in the process of going there repeatedly, interacted with many, many people who were involved in projects that were about reforming the economy, about helping to establish civil society, about trying to set up a new legal system, and so forth. So many, many aspects of the kinds of reform that might produce democracy, but frankly in Uzbekistan so far have not. And one of the projects that I got involved with was an organization called Open Society Institute. Open Society, anybody ever heard of Open Society? Maybe a couple of people. Okay, well that's good, because I was worried that I would come here and everybody would know about this, and then I'd have nothing to say. So Open Society is an organization that was established by a billionaire financier named George Soros. And Soros is, he's a hedge fund or derivative kind of guy, I'm not really sure, quantum fund, made billions and billions in the business and then decided he wanted to give back. He was a Hungarian emigre who left Hungary in the 1940s and went to the US and studied sort of Karl Popper sort of theories of society and of democracy and economy, and then he went to Wall Street, made a whole lot of money. But by the 1970s, he began asking questions about, well, why is it that in Eastern Europe there's all this communism, that in so many other parts of the world there are unfree states? And he became interested in trying to change this using his own money. So beginning in the late 70s, he began donating money, for example, to black South African students to help them organize at universities in South Africa against the apartheid regime. In the 1980s, he was one of the private funders of Solidarity, funneling money to Solidarity in Poland as they were creating their movement, and to Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. He eventually turned this into a more systematic kind of approach by creating a non-profit organization, which is now called Open Society Institute. And it really launched into action in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He began to put incredible amounts of money and effort into trying to stimulate civil society organizations and concepts of reform in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And so throughout the former Soviet space, but especially Central Asia and the Caucasus, Open Society Institute began to open its offices, which offered scholarships, for example, to students. One of them was Mikhail Saakashvili. Anybody know that name? Yeah, president of Georgia. He went to Georgetown University, and the Open Society spent a lot of money supporting him and supporting a whole lot of other Georgian students to come to the U.S. Soros' idea here is that by spreading liberal education, by sort of reforming educational systems and so forth, you can create an impetus toward a democratic society. And that is the aspect of his organization that I've been involved in. The Open Society Institute creates these kinds of scholarships and seminar programs and so forth. And they started in the late 1990s to organize summer institutes for university lecturers from former Soviet space. And they would set up a summer institute that was a 2 or 3 week session in a place like St. Petersburg or Almaty or something like that. And university lecturers from universities in Central Asia and in Russia would gather at this seminar. And the idea was to bring in European and U.S. scholars who would work with these university lecturers on the kinds of intellectual ideas that they all that are popular in their sphere. So for me, historiography, how theories of historical change have emerged and what kinds of theories of historical change we often work with in Western universities, and comparing that with what they're working with and getting them to read our literature and creating this kind of intellectual exchange. Now that is not something that on the surface of it leads necessarily to a democratic society. But in Soros's understanding of the issue, critical thought and the ability to dissent is formed in liberal education. And so this is kind of his impetus for funding these things, and it's a huge amount of funding. It really is. It's a tremendous amount of money that goes into things like this. So I've been involved with these projects for a few years, and I go to Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or some such place in the summer and do a series of lectures and discussions with a group of lecturers there on history. Now, in my own understanding of this, there's a little irony that's going on here, and I always find it when I talk with my colleagues who do the same thing. American academics, we are not an ideological bunch. We are more interested in popping balloons than we are in creating them. So you come in here with your fancy idea of democracy or socialism or whatever, let me undermine you. That's my approach to critical thought. I found it sort of interesting to think, let me see, what are we really doing here? We're getting together in this seminar, and Soros would like it if somehow all of these people walk away convinced that a democratic society is a better thing, and I am highly unlikely to stand there and say, hey guys, listen, a democratic society is a much better thing. But in thinking through the process, what is going on in these summer seminars is an intellectual exchange and an international set of relationships, and a way of kicking around ideas that a lot of my colleagues in Central Asia have not been exposed to before. For them, history is truth with a T, and you learn history and you just collect more facts, and it helps you to prove that history. Whereas for me, in a Western model of education, history is an argument. And it is many arguments, and we play them out against each other, and that is one of the things that enables us to have open thought and to have critical thought and to create the kind of dynamic that leads to a liberal democracy. So for me, I think, so why did I start doing this? Well, I did it because it sounded interesting, not because I signed on some sheet that said I'm going to spread democracy. And why are my Central Asian colleagues doing this? They get 2 weeks free seminar at a nice location and a little stipend, and the biggie, the big reward is if they go through this seminar and they start figuring out these international intellectual currents and how those might add to their own research, then they can apply for a 3-year, multiple $1,000 fellowship that will enable them to travel to the US and to go everywhere else for research. And so there's a big incentive there for them. Did they go into it because they're saying, you know, what I want to do is I want to have Mr. Soros help me become a democratic thinker? No, not at all. There are some interesting things that go on with international funding of attempts to spread democracy. The funder's intention may be one thing. The consumer's intention may be quite a different thing. And I will never say that my colleagues in Central Asia are wrong any more than I am wrong for putting in for whatever grant I can get and doing whatever I can with it. In the process, does it change people? It does create international networks. It does create communication across borders. It does create a new familiarity with ideas. And one of the things that these seminars try to do is to change teaching styles so that those university lecturers will return to their classrooms and try to work with critical thought rather than simply let me tell you the truth. So this is the kind of project that I've been involved in, and it's only one of really a huge number of attempts to export democracy. But I'm going to give you the little Open Society mission statement here, and what I'm trying to, I underline a bunch of words because they're sort of key words in the exporting democracy community. So Open Society works to build vibrant and tolerant democracies. We can see immediately that their intent is exporting democracy. Governments that are accountable, okay, and we'll come back to this term, good governance, big flash word for exporting democracy. They seek to shape public policies that assure fairness in political, legal, and economic systems, fundamental rights, so rights, fairness, justice, education, in the media, and work against corruption and work towards freedom of information. So all of these are kind of elements within their program. And if we look at, okay, Soros has really, he's a very generous man. He's put oodles of money into this program, and he has things that work toward all of these for media, for politics, for legal rights, and so forth. And he's one of the big actors in this exporting democracy community. Okay, so then if we're talking about that, this is what democracy exporters are really thinking about when they're doing what they're doing. What do we mean when we say democracy? And we could have three kinds of definitions here. The first one that is often used is a very limited definition. It is basically that you have elections. We have elections, we're a democracy. Well, Iraq has had a bunch of elections, and ta-da, so it's a democracy. That, for a lot of people who think a little more deeply about exporting democracy, that is an inadequate definition. It focuses on a particular process without any question about who shapes that process, who gets to speak, who gets to run, whether it is fair, whether it is meaningful. There's an election, that's enough, so it's a democracy. In the late 1990s, after Russia had, okay, there was this giant euphoria with the collapse of the Soviet Union that was, oh, Russia has stopped being an authoritarian or regime, and so now it's going to become a democracy. And there was a lot of teleological thinking that said, oh, well, if you don't have authoritarianism anymore, that must mean you're on the road to democracy. And after a few elections with Yeltsin bringing out the tanks and shutting down other people's media outlets and a general system of thuggery where the large funders of elections were mafia and so forth, the American political establishment began to use the term procedural. Russia is a procedural democracy. And I asked one of these thinkers, Michael McFaul, what he really meant by that, and he said, well, what it means is, yeah, they do go through the motions of an election, and to some extent that election is meaningful because the people who go and vote, well, they probably do care which side they're voting for. They do get more than one choice. But aside from that, the other elements that would create a real democracy are lacking. What are those other elements? A liberal definition, then, of democracy focuses, this is the one that Freedom House uses when they're pulling together that map of what is free and what is not only meaningful elections, but also equal rights, women's rights, minority rights, the right of dissent and so forth, rule of law, good governance, freedom of expression. A system that attempts to be democratic but does not include one of those elements. Okay, it's democratic, but we don't have equal rights for women. Not really a democracy. It's democratic, but good governance is completely lacking. No, then it is far too easy. If the system is rife with corruption, it's pretty hard to say that the outcome of an election actually represents the free will of the people. It probably doesn't. Freedom of expression, yeah. Obviously, you have to have a political voice in order to have a meaningful election and to create a government that you want. A third definition of democracy that is often used, and that I will clue you in, Freedom House absolutely does not use, is social democracy, which emphasizes citizens' rights to economic equality, perhaps even more than their right to political equality. And of course, that's why we would talk about the people's democracy of China, the people's democracy of Korea, the peoples, or the kind of programs that Hugo Chavez is pursuing. He would say that he's more interested in citizens' equal economic rights than he is in their, clearly in their freedom of expression. So for Freedom House, when Freedom House goes through and does that interesting map, let's see if we can go back to that map, what they're measuring are those kinds of criteria, that sense of rule of law, good governance, not so much good governance, they don't care about that one so much, freedom of expression, freedom of really, truly meaningful elections. And that's what they're trying to represent on this map. And when you look at their materials, they're quite interesting. They've got great analyses of various countries. Okay, so here's a little quotation from political scientist Valerie Bunce. Liberal democracy based on a respect for individual rights, limits on the power of the state, freedom of expression, and open contestation for government office can be notoriously difficult to measure. If democracy is measured more restrictively as the use of elections to fill government posts, then a much broader application of the term becomes possible. You can consider darn near every country in the world a democracy then, if all it is about carrying out some elections. Even China, they carry out elections. So this was a distinction that she was coming to when she was looking at Russia in the 1990s and saying, wait, no, what we're seeing here is not democracy as we'd like to see it. Procedures, yes. The rights and the protections, no. Okay, so who does democracy promotion? When you start following the money trail of democracy promotion institutions that are carrying out projects in much of the world, they tend to go back to USAID, the UN, which of course is itself a product of donations from certain countries, to the EU, the World Bank, and then to a bunch of foundations like Soros and Carnegie and Ford and so forth. So it's largely funded by the United States government, Canadian government, and EU, and then by these large foundations as well. When did this really start? This started more recently than you would think. In one sense, we can look at everything post-World War II. In many contexts, the U.S. was very concerned with creating democracy, and we can see that in the way that post-war things went in Japan and so forth. But by and large, there was, during much of the Cold War, the Eisenhower attitude, they may be sons of bitches, but at least they're our sons of bitches, and there really was not such a great interest in promoting democracy per se. Where we see this really becoming a clear funded U.S. priority was under Ronald Reagan in 1983, when he sort of made this big statement and set up the National Endowment for Democracies. National Endowment for Democracy is a funding stream. It's U.S. government gives a bunch of money to National Endowment for Democracy. National Endowment for Democracy then largely began to split it up between two entities, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. Let's give both parties a chance, right? And so in the 1980s, they began to have small kinds of projects, largely in a few Latin American countries. But in the 1980s, we were seeing a wave of interesting democratizations that had nothing to do with U.S. attempts to export democracy. Korea, for example, went from being a dictatorship, more or less, to a democracy in about 1987, and Taiwan in 1990, and so forth. And there were a lot of these, if you remember the Philippines, that was a big one, didn't have a lot to do with U.S. support. That was people choosing democracy on their own. People in that nation making their own national choices. The democracy promotion thing really got going for the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in fact for the EU as well. The European Union, of course, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, began very actively creating organizations, institutions, funding civil society and so forth in Eastern Europe in particular in order to try to shape what would come in the future. And for the U.S. Began doing that and pointing a lot of money at the former Soviet Union. Some of the organizations that became strong out of this would include the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which does a lot with election monitoring, with helping countries to set up electoral systems that might somehow be free and fair. Transparency International, which is a big international NGO that is funded largely by the EU and Deutsche Bank, but also by USAID, which monitors corruption, government corruption, with the idea that you cannot have a fair system if it is rife with corruption. Freedom House, which does a lot of this comparative stuff, and Carnegie and so forth. Now, what really happens is U.S. government, EU, gives a pot of money to an intermediary. That intermediary then holds grant and contract competitions with all sorts of subordinate organizations, which then have their money and then themselves go and look for partners in different countries. So Soros, okay, Soros does it with his own money as opposed to U.S. government money, but when Soros does this, he has, the OSI has these annual competitions, and your civil society entity, whether it is based in the U.S. or based in Iraq, can apply for some grant, get a stream of funding, and support a particular project that might be about educating people about their democratic rights. It might be about legal reform on the local level. It might be about creating media transparency or something else. So all of this then doesn't look like it comes directly from the EU government or government organizations or directly from the United States government. It goes through intermediaries. But in fact, most of the money does go back to governments. Okay, so in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan or one of my favorite places in Central Asia, a local civil society organization, like my friend Marfua's women's organization in Tashkent, could apply to one of these foundations, one of these democracy spreaders, for a big grant to undertake some particular project that she would tell them this will help to achieve these goals of creating a more democratic society or something like that. And this is the way that most of this, especially the building civil society stuff, has been done. It's been done through competitive grant making. There's some real advantages and some real problems with this. The advantages: donors, funders become aware of a new problem and they can channel money toward it. So for example, when the Millennium Development Goals were established in the late 1990s, and a big element of the Millennium Development Goals was benchmarking countries based on women's literacy and women's employment and women's participation in the public sphere. All of a sudden, all of these civil society, little local organizations or statewide organizations had a hook. And they would say, aha, we could get some money for improving lives of women. How? Microloans or education or empowerment kinds of things. And so we will apply for a big grant and we'll do that. And so you can put big money to a new priority. That's really great. It meant that local NGOs in any given country, you're in Kyrgyzstan, you begin to look at all of that literature and you say, aha, what is it those donors want to give money for? Okay, that's what I'm going to gear my organization toward. Grants may enhance accountability because they're given on a term basis and they might be renewable, and they're definitely not going to be renewed if your funder thinks that you haven't done the right thing with them. However, I mean, they don't really create accountability because the fact is you could take your grant and go build a house, and if you don't get it renewed, well, what the heck, you have your house. So these kinds of grants can provide a lot of encouragement to local democracy activists. My friend Marfua, she's an amazing democracy activist in Uzbekistan and an activist for equal rights for women and so forth. And I know that her participation in these kinds of grants, her ability to go to meetings and meet with other people outside of Uzbekistan, it's helped her perspective, it's enabled her to create all sorts of interesting new approaches to what she does. There are some serious disadvantages to this kind of funding. The first one is that all of life for every civil society organization is a constant scramble for new grants, always focused on whatever that donor might want now. And so rather than building interests out of their own community and saying, what is it that we need? What is it that we're going to focus on? How can we change our society in meaningful ways? They instead tend to look toward what is their money for. That's what I'll do. A second major problem with this is that the grants come and go, and so do the NGOs. Lots and lots of women's shelters in Russia were formed in the 1990s. A lot of them got grant funding from foreign donors, and when that funding dried up, women's shelter closed down. They couldn't keep going. And that is precisely because this approach to funding creates the possibility for civil society organizations to become dependent on foreign donors, and they don't put their effort into creating their local allies, their local buy-in, their local supporters, the ones who could actually sustain this effort in the long run, and the ones who themselves are going to be the people that create democracy. You actually can't create democracy through donations. It won't work. However, to get a democracy promotion grant, learn the magic words: free and fair elections, civil society, good governments, rule of law, and after 9/11, preventing terrorism. The whole democracy promotion community got a new direction after 9/11, and that was connected to many of our analyses of why there is terrorism in the world. And one of those analyses is that countries where rights are lacking, where people are oppressed, where people are held down by their government and poor and so forth, those are places that will generate terrorists. And that doesn't really hold up to analysis, but it was a strong rhetorical point, and it began to become a point that you would make when you were writing your "this is why you should give me money for my democratic promotion" kind of project, because it will help to prevent terrorism. This is, I know this quite well from the examples of Central Asia, where in Uzbekistan, yes, there are some small terrorist groups. And let me tell you, there are an awful lot of grad students who've gotten some really good money to do their research based on a really, really, really small phenomenon that we all learned that, well, this will help, my research will help to prevent terrorism in the future. Well, that's a good way to get grants. And I'm being cynical there. Geez, did you notice? There's some reality to it. It is important to try to understand where terrorism comes from and why people become attracted to those ideas and what conditions make those ideas flourish. But often in the democracy promotion community, the cart goes before the horse. You make an assumption. If we would have democracy, then we wouldn't have terrorism. What was that in Austin the other day? A little problem with that. Where is democracy being exported? So there are these very active projects. I'll give you a little sequence here. We'll do a little bit of Soviet Union stuff, and then we'll skip over to the Middle East. After 1991, the former Soviet Union was prime territory for democracy exportation. So was Eastern Europe. And if we compare those, there really is no comparison. The Eastern European stuff worked really quite well, and the former Soviet Union stuff not so well. If we look back at that map, in former Soviet space, the Baltic states, quite free. They managed that. And interestingly, they're crediting Ukraine here with being quite free, although I would say that's because Freedom House doesn't care about good governance whatsoever. But Eastern Europe, most of Eastern Europe established quite free, liberal democracies that do protect the rights of their citizens, that do more or less, there are always problems, but and there are some cardinal differences here. Both the EU and the US were involved with the former Soviet stuff. The Eastern European stuff, yes, the US was involved, but the EU was deeply, deeply committed to this and put a great deal of effort, and those Eastern European countries had huge incentive to meet new benchmarks, because eventually that could mean for them EU accession. And so there was not simply resource there was also incentive in a way that there wasn't in the former Soviet states. So in Russia in the 1990s, there were all of these foreign efforts to try to bolster, help grow civil society. But the upshot of the 1990s was more or less the creation of a procedural democracy, so that there are meaningful elections, but with one character's heavy thumb on the scales, those meaningful elections are not going to produce any political change. In the 2000s, the situation became really fascinating with the Georgian Revolution, 2003. And when that revolution took place, people who work directly with George Soros have told me that they had to really hold him down in order to keep him from getting on a plane the very next day and going to Georgia and saying, "Yay, we did it." You know, it's like, wait, George, calm down. You don't want to give the impression that you just bought a revolution here. Which he didn't. But the people in Georgia, this was their revolution. He supported it. He gave a lot of money to it. The seed money for democracy promotion there had produced something. And that was why he was excited about it. For him, it was a validation of this method. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 presented a more problematic example. In the Orange Revolution, and my window on that is, interestingly, I have a wonderful former grad student who worked for the OSCE and was completely involved in the efforts to democratize the elections in Ukraine that year. And he wrote a thesis on it, and so we talked an awful lot about what was going on, when it was going on, and later. In that revolution, we would call it, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the whole emphasis of the democracy promotion characters was very specifically on elections, on creating the ability of Ukrainians to get together, to express their opinion, to vote for the people that they wanted to have a free and fair election. And then when the free and fair election didn't happen, the leaders of the grassroots organizations and the civil society organizations drew on models that they had learned in training camps with Georgian revolutionaries and Serbian revolutionaries to go out on the streets and make a big stand and essentially demand a new election. But more or less what they were saying is, we didn't like the outcome of this election, so we want a new one. And we didn't like the outcome of the election because it was not a fair election. This effort was not well supported with other things, the kinds of measures that would bring about an end to corruption, the kinds of things that would allow media to truly be competitive, the kinds of things that would bolster the other aspects of democratic growth. And so what we see is a truly meaningful election in Ukraine in that year, but between then and now, not a whole lot of consolidation of democracy, except that people are committed to elections. What happened after 2004 was a giant backlash, with Putin in particular and many other authoritarian heads of state in former Soviet territories saying the last thing we want is to have a Rose Revolution or an Orange Revolution. And they focused directly on the exporting democracy community. And the way they did that was by saying, you can have your civil society organization, but you can't get funding from abroad. Or if you get funding from these particular characters, in particular open society, we'll close you down. And so since then, a tremendous number of foreign-funded non-governmental organizations in Russia and in Belarus and in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan and in Uzbekistan and so forth have been closed down. The governments will not allow them to operate because it's an interesting thing, because I can cynically stand on the side and say, does this democracy promotion thing work? I think Vladimir Putin thinks it does, and that's why he closed those down. So some autocratic governments then, this is Timothy Carruthers, one of the big talking heads in the, I shouldn't call him, that sounds disparaging, I actually respect the guy, a big name in the democracy promotion kind of community. Some autocratic governments have won substantial public sympathy by arguing that opposition to Western democracy promotion is resistance not to democracy itself, but to American interventionism. And this is where the whole thing runs into colossal problems throughout the Middle East, throughout all sorts of places. And, Nothing like rallying your country against foreign intervention. We've seen that a lot with Iran's responses to last summer's demonstrations. So, democracy promotion in Afghanistan. Well, of course, let's make quite clear from the start that the reason that we invaded Afghanistan was not to create democracy. That became an ideal, of course, because when the U.S. carries out some sort, I say it as though it sounds like we do this every week. When the U.S. overthrows some government, we want to replace them with a democracy. The U.S. doesn't normally go around overthrowing governments, but and in fact, Afghanistan, could we say that they had a government? Well, only a very small government that didn't have a whole lot of authority. So the U.S. NATO invasion was not about creating, it wasn't, we went there to create democracy, but once you're there, you might as well do that, right? Because this was a U.S. and NATO partnership, Europeans had a big voice in it, U.S. had a big voice in it, and the outcome then in Afghanistan had to be a result of that partnership. So the problem, okay, so initially, if you recall, there was the big Bonn conference where the Loya Jirga took place, and these people representing all sorts of groups within Afghanistan got together to say, what kind of government would we like? And that was a great start as far as the democracy promotion people were concerned, because it's saying, let's build this government from the ground up according to what Afghans think and want. The problem after that, of course, is that civil society growth, meaningful elections can't take place when people are killing each other. Just doesn't work. If you're afraid to go outside, you definitely are not going to go down the street and sign up for your little civil society organization, much less give them money and turn them into a self-sustaining kind of entity that's going to grow democracy in your country. So to say the Loya Jirga represents the will of the people, and hence now Afghanistan has a democratic government, well, they had the structure of it, they had the intention of it, and the things that needed to surround that to make it a possibility, to make it a sustainable, growable thing were not there. We have seen over the number of years since 2001 then that Afghanistan has not been able to deliver. The government can't deliver. Its bailiwick is centered on Kabul, can't get its any good effects out into the countryside until quite recently. We're hoping things are changing over the past year and a half, something like that. Immediately, there were lots. Now, this is, although democracy exporters could say, okay, so what we want to do is help build these structures and support civil society, Afghans themselves had a lot of organizations, mostly external to Afghanistan. They were made up of people in exile communities who were very, very excited about the new possibilities in Afghanistan, who went back, who tried to do all sorts of things, open universities and create women's organizations and create local micro-funded credit things and all sorts of other things. So there were a lot of Afghans who had these great ideas, who went back home and who tried to put them into action, and then a lot of them got into the foreign funding stream as well, so that foreign donors were trying to support their actions. Can they turn that into something meaningful? Well, they can. They are capable of it. The problem, of course, is that if you start in the wrong place, or if you are in a situation of continual violence, the best intentions in the world are not going to produce an exciting, vibrant, new, democratic local society. So the foreign donor community, in particular, the democracy promotion community, because it is in no way focused on economic equality, tends to ignore people's real human needs and instead focuses on their need for speech. Okay, that is a real human need, but it's not quite the same thing as feeding yourself. And so the kinds of money that got channeled to Afghanistan for civil society promotion were often about things that didn't meet the kinds of needs that Afghans needed met at the time. Groups that help everyone to understand their rights are all well and good, but if you can't make a living, well, you're not going to be too attracted to that group. So in Afghanistan, then, this democracy promotion thing happens in a not very favorable atmosphere because of all of the violence, and with actors who perhaps aren't always focused on what is the first need. In the Middle East and North Africa, after 2003 in particular, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, then George Bush put a whole lot of emphasis on how we are going to spread democracy in the Middle East. We're going to encourage the growth of democracies because lack of democracy is what causes terrorism. So we want to promote democracy. The EU had been at this for quite a while. Had been working with Mediterranean area countries. And the EU approach had been primarily that if you liberalize the economy, that will lead to liberal politics. And so they had focused most of their efforts on liberalizing economies instead. And they had put a lot of their democracy promotion funds into good governance, fighting corruption, and so forth. The interesting contradiction here is that good governance funding tends to work against strengthening civil society in some ways. And so we have this, after 9/11, democracy is an antidote to terrorism. There are new ways of getting grants. Spreading democracy becomes a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, at least in certain places. The U.S. actually did try and pursue this in certain places, and not so much in others. But with the invasion of Iraq, that kind of gave democracy promotion a bad name. As soon as we invaded Iraq, an awful lot of people around the world who had been very enthusiastic about the U.S. and its democracy promotion efforts suddenly saw it as extremely cynical of the U.S. to say what we're trying to do is spread democracy. We were interested in taking down Saddam Hussein. In creating a democracy, well, yeah, of course, you take out a government, yeah, you want them to have a new democratic system. So the really shocking thing about it was that in the first year of the Iraq campaign, even though Washington, D.C. is littered with democracy promotion experts, very few of them were used in any way, shape, or form under the CPA. The CPA kind of approached this as terra incognita, and didn't know what to do in their first year. And the early statement was, well, maybe we can get the UN to do that democracy promotion kind of thing. And then after the UN headquarters got blown up in Baghdad, the UN wasn't terribly excited about doing that. So one of the reports before this invasion in 2000 noted that the U.S. Was looking for regime change in Iraq ever since the late 1990s, and the characters that were driving that in the U.S. came from a variety of Iraqi expat political groups, none of which were what we would call democratic in orientation. And so this year 2000 report said, you know, is it really likely that Iraq is going to turn out to be a liberal democracy if even the people that we're hoping to replace a Saddam Hussein with are themselves in no way, shape, or form liberal Democrats? So state building, then the elections without state building, that's essentially Iraq for a couple of years. Without state building and without good governance, you can't have a fair and meaningful election. Yes, it was very encouraging to see all the Shia Iraqis go out in 2005 and cast their votes. And that is a meaningful and important step in Iraq, and it's a psychological step, and it changes things, but by itself, it does not create a sustainable democracy. It may create enthusiasm for one among some people, but it has to be surrounded with other things that are more expensive state-building measures. Because the elections came certain democracy analysts have noted that where you replace an authoritarian system with an electoral system really rapidly, electoral groups tend to consolidate around ethnic and sectarian lines. Those are their political, those are their personal orientations, and that is what comes out then in politics. And that doesn't actually bode well for a long-term democratic kind of society. In Iraq, one of the huge problems has been corruption, the lack of good governance, the fact that anyone with a connection to money uses it. And so this is a different way of measuring some of the things that go on in democracy promotion. This is Transparency International's analysis of countries, where what they're focused on is, does the government deliver? Does it deliver equal access to money, to the ability to earn a living and so forth through its suppression of corruption? And if we notice on this, this is from 2008, Iraq is dead last in the Middle East, and it's almost dead last in the world, and they have 181 countries on this. So even if Iraq is, when the level of violence is coming down, the level of corruption is still so high that it seems hard to figure out how Iraq will move toward being a more meaningful democracy. Fukuyama notes that state-building agendas such as strengthening the military and the police, which are really important for ending corruption, especially in places where a state has collapsed, say Afghanistan, may conflict with democracy promotion agendas. You strengthen the police, you may make it harder for civil society to operate, harder for people to dissent. And that, for example, in Tunisia, the EU really has promoted democratization in Tunisia, but their approach was liberalizing the economy and then working toward good governance. Tunisia is much less corrupt than it used to be. Tunisia is not a place where you can run a party against the government. And so the very strengthening of anti-corruption measures itself strengthens an existing government. And so these two aspects of trying to create some sort of fair and civil society may run counter to each other. So good governance is necessary for sustainable democracy, but effective anti-corruption efforts demand working with existing governments, which strengthens the existing government rather than the opposition. So is democracy promotion effective? It can support movements. Too much support creates two problems. One is total dependence on outside funders so that people don't actually create and sustain their own local networks, and it creates the appearance, at least, of imperialism, that your agenda is an outsider's agenda, that it's not really, you're not in this for yourself. The central role of U.S. policy, this is one of the sad things that came out of those very strong statements from the Bush administration about we're going to promote democracy in the Middle East. It created all sorts of false hopes. All sorts of Middle Eastern civil society organizations like in Egypt were very, very excited about this, and then they saw nothing out of it, and in fact their government crushed them rather further. We have to ask what the goal is of exporting democracy. Is it to create more friendly states for the U.S., or is it that we really, really, truly care about democracy, whether that new democracy likes us or not? And for some of the democracy exporting organizations, I'd say for OSI, they're interested in creating democracies, whether those democracies like the U.S. or not. For others, if it's funded through the National Endowment for Democracy, the NDI, the IRI, et cetera, well, there are reasons that we're not actually pursuing heavy democracy promotion in Azerbaijan, which has lots of oil and a government that is working with us, or in Egypt, a government that is working with us. We pursue it more in some places than in others because democracy itself may not be the sole goal of these policies. There isn't a single formula that will produce democracy. One of the problems is that governments that really feel threatened will crack down, as in Iran. Democracy promotion, I would say, from my own little window on it, is kind of like planting a tree. You plant a tree, and maybe somebody comes along and chops it down. Or maybe in 50 years, it's a beautiful, gorgeous shade tree. It's a long-term process. It's not something that can happen overnight. So I am going to stop there and have a little time for questions. I really thought that I would, I hope I haven't been tedious, because I thought that this would be a shorter talk than it was. Okay, so I'll go back to that lively map so that you don't have to look at boring words. There we go. Okay, questions? Go ahead, stand up and speak loudly.
I think it's a little, I find it counterintuitive that efforts to reduce corruption can work against civil society. And I'm just curious if you would expand brings in the regime that may be in effect. But still, the end result is that essentially eliminating corruption means you're promoting the rule of law. If you get more rule of law, that seems to me a step towards democracy, a step towards civil society.
Right, and so it may depend on in what areas you're promoting good governance. But good governance, one of the starting places, I mean, it's very hard to look at a society and say, so where does corruption start and where do you stop it and so forth. And it seems easier to focus on the everyday interaction between citizen and state, which often happens through the police. So you start with the police. You start with trying to pay the police better so that they will not take bribes, so that they will not overlook these crimes and pursue those crimes. I know that, okay, for me, the most painful example of where trying to promote good governance comes in conflict with civil society, it comes out of the fact that rulers who want to hang on to their power will, okay? And so in Uzbekistan, some years ago, the U.S. actually has had a lot of interactions with the military and the police in Uzbekistan and did a lot of training with them on things like counterterrorism, bringing them to the U.S., taking them through kind of ethics training and all of this, and they helped to make them a more effective force against all sorts of people, you know, the narco traffickers and stuff like that. And because they were a more effective force, when in 2005, was it 2005? Yeah, May, in Andijan there was a big public demonstration against what was perceived by a lot of people to be government misdeeds, where the government had arrested some dissenters and put them in jail and was putting them on trial. There was a big, big demonstration, and that very effective new force went out and shot hundreds. And so the kinds of training that go into producing good governance and helping to create a more effective system where you're not becoming a cop so that you can make money. You're becoming a cop because you love your nation and you really do care about having an orderly society. Those same values can be manipulated by leaders who tell you that this is what having an orderly society means. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that. And that doesn't come out of the process itself. It's not an inherent necessity. It is the response that's the problem. And so we could say that it's not the effort to promote good governance that's the problem. It's the ways that certain authoritarian rulers make use of the tools that gives them.
The picture you paint is very bleak in the sense that after going through this,
I focused on bad examples.
well, the examples say we really don't know how to. I want to be careful not to say export democracy. We want to make the world a better place for people to live. And there are a couple of examples where, if you will, benevolent dictatorship has been very successful. Singapore, Turkey, I'd argue maybe Tunisia, certainly it's the most liberal of the Middle Eastern countries. Has anyone gone there and said, how did it work here? And how did it keep from slipping back? It's a much more positive picture than you paint.
Right. We could focus on, I could have focused the talk instead on Estonia, which turns out to be really wonderful, and democracy promotion works there and so forth. One of the interesting, this is just sort of a political science analysis that may or may not help with this question. We may have a misalignment of expectations, and I think it is not a bad thing to hope and want and even support efforts for every country in the world to eventually become a free and open society. I think that's a good thing, actually. However, we probably should recognize that many of these things are much more gradual and stepwise than we think. Turkey was, it was a one-man rule kind of place until 1938, and then Kemal Ataturk died, and then it began to become more democratic, and now it is quite democratic, although lacking in that whole minority rights category, right? And so this is kind of a long and slow process that goes from one place to another. And there are a couple of analysts, Alex Hedanius and Jan Torel, who looked at hundreds of such government transitions from 1970s up to the present. All kinds, they go in this direction and they go in that direction, and they basically said the breakdown of an authoritarian regime does not necessarily signal the onset of democratic transformation. From 1972 to 2003, 77% of transitions from authoritarian government resulted in another authoritarian government. Only 23% of such transitions led to democracy. They said then that, okay, so in what conditions is it more likely to go to democracy? A transition to democracy is more likely when the pre-existing government was some sort of multi-party structure with limited competition. So, in fact, perhaps what we would call a procedural democracy. It is highly unlikely from a pure one-party state, which is instead more likely to transition to a less comprehensive form of dominance, some kind of multi-party form with limited competition. And so, if we're looking at transitions that are more likely, well, in fact, Kazakhstan, with its multiple parties that are not terribly meaningful, but somewhat meaningful, eventually, yes, perhaps it's much more likely that now they would transition to something that is a much broader democracy than it was likely 20 years ago when they were under one-party rule. And so if we kind of look at the broad scheme of things, that tends to be where we see those changes happen, from the authoritarian multi-party kind of structure into a more democratic place. Yeah?
The cynic in me wants to ask why I should care.
Because we put a lot of money into this. You should know where your money's going.
As a historian, tell me, how long did it take the British to develop what we would call a democracy?
As a historian, I would say that America became a democracy in 1963 with the Voting Rights Act. Up until then, we wouldn't measure up to Freedom House's definition of democracy. So that's the wow. When this is what we want to see, and that's a long time. Britain, it's a long time. In many places, it's a long time, and this is in fact what most places. In the stands, they always say, you want us to be a democracy, but you took hundreds of, darn right. And it's a long, slow process. And yet, on the other side, it's a process that you don't get somewhere without having a goal. People, and in so many countries, people are working toward this because they want it, not because I want it for them, because they want it. And that is where the democracy, why put money into these things? Why do it? I keep on going back and forth on this. Like, is this exercising good judgment or not? But for people who want to reform their own government so that there is more equality, so that there is a greater voice, so that people aren't afraid of being arbitrarily arrested and so forth, I think it's important to give them at least moral support. Over there, somebody. Yes. Okay.
My question plays off that. Do you think the advent of the internet and access to information worldwide will speed up people in more oppressed countries demanding democracy?
We have seen that already. I mean, we saw it in Myanmar and in Tibet and in Iran and so forth. That it creates different modes. It allows a different kind of connection that allows people to get together in a more rapid fashion, spread ideas in a more rapid fashion, and create networks that can make these demands. However, media itself doesn't seem to be sufficient. Traditionally, in the grand scheme of things, these things come about because of organization, because of movements that consolidate into something that can be sort of stable and long-term and forward-looking and pushing an agenda. The Iran thing isn't quite there yet, for example. It's a giant coalition of people who are hoping for change, but they haven't consolidated into some kind of movement that can strategize about that change yet, or at least if they have, we haven't seen it. So there seems to be a utility of that new media, but I'm not sure that it by itself can make the kind of change.
We're beginning to run towards
yes, I don't want to take up your coffee break.
So let's take one more question.
Over here.
To use the metaphor of a parent and a child, it occurs to me that we as a society may be a very successful parent, albeit that parent has become successful by very hard work over a long period of time. And now we are looking at children, small people, and we think we know the right way. And in fact, it works for us. But we took a long time to get there. We worked very, very hard to get there. There wasn't anything that anybody could give us.
Right.
Even though as a parent, I would love to be able to give my child that good life. I know that my kid has to earn it.
Right.
To the extent that we try and export that, I think it's going to have to be much more of a deal where democracy becomes a policy of attraction rather than promotion.
And I think that in any place where it's actually succeeded, it has primarily been because of the efforts of people within those places who have pushed for that and chosen that. Even in a place like Georgia, what role does the foreign funder really play? Some support, some connections, but a foreign funder cannot create anything like this. It can't be there unless the people themselves want it and are willing to put, they're the ones that put their lives on the line for whatever it is. It's never the foreigner that does that. But the metaphor is difficult for me, and yet it always comes out. Because when you have the money, you're the one with the power in some sense, and you do wind up with this parent-child relationship also. It's very hard to rethink that in terms of partnership and in terms of empowerment and in terms of this is your thing. If I can help you out somehow with some funding or some connections, great, but this is your thing. And it's those relations, I think people in the democracy promotion fields try hard to work at this as partnership and not as me, I'm the great outside expert, I'm going to come in and help you benighted backward person turn into an enlightened Democrat. That's pretty appalling. But it's pretty easy to adopt that attitude when you are the one with the money.